Right now, though, it's time to talk about small boats and smashing gangs and all of that, because Isabel Oakeshott joins us, Talks international editor. She's been abroad taking a look at what some other people do to stop the gangs. Isabel, very good morning to you.
Good morning. Yes. So I spent a few days last week in Libya, all places. It's not a place that many journalists actually set foot in.
Right.
A lot of people may remember that basically it was taken over by ISIS after the fall of Gaddafi, which was something that we, the UK, were pretty involved in making happen. And then we did what we normally do and ran for cover, and chaos ensued. So I was in the east of Libya, which is actually quite peaceful and safe and stable now. And I was looking at what they do when they're talking about smashing the gangs. They actually do smash the gangs, almost literally. I mean, the operations that they undertake are pretty serious. And why did I go to Libya? Well, because it's actually on the front line of the immigration crisis in a way that nobody's really talking about, because of where it is at the top of Africa. A lot of illegal immigrants who end up in the UK have come through Libya from, for example, primarily Sudan, where there's a civil war on, and they flow up through Libya and do their best to get across the desert, all the way up through Libya, and then onto small boats across the Mediterranean. And obviously, we only see them when they get to the Channel. But the problem is starting in Africa. And I wanted to see what it is that they are doing over there to try to stop it. Now, they could just be sitting back and sort of waving them through. After all, it's not their problem, the Libyans, if these illegal migrants are actually aiming to get to Europe. But they are working very, very hard to try to reduce the numbers. And they don't muck around, as you can imagine. They think nothing of deporting people. When they talk about, stopping the boats is what they actually do.
Yeah, so they don't let them get on the boats, I suppose, is what they need to do, and they have to stop them from getting from wherever it is via Sudan or whichever part of sub-Saharan Africa to the port, I suppose. Because I remember doing stories some years ago of an awful lot of sort of aid ships, things like, Save the Children would have a ship just off the coast of Libya, and as soon as anybody sort of took off in a small boat, they would go and rescue them, even if they weren't being asked to rescue them, and then they'd deliver them over to Lampedusa or somewhere, or Greece, with their own steam.
Well, so as you say, the idea is to stop these illegal immigrants ever actually getting to the coast, getting nowhere near a beach. And so much of the work that the Libyan National Army is doing is focused right down at the bottom of Libya, by the border with Sudan, near Eritrea, near where there's a sort of confluence of countries, and immigrants are all flowing in at that point. But of course, some do slip through. I mean, the numbers are actually enormous. So you then have another opportunity to try to stop them at the other end, as it were, the exit point, which is the coast. And, they are doing their best in a way that helps the UK enormously, because, if a Sudanese refugee gets as far as the UK, if they manage to get across the Channel, they have a 99% chance of remaining in the UK. We basically don't send anyone back to Sudan. Now, human rights people will say, campaigners will say, well, quite right too, Sudan has a civil war going on. But to be fair on the Libyans who will deport to Sudan, they only deport to parts of the country that they consider safe. They don't simply write it all off. In many ways, our approach to this is a bit unsophisticated, isn't it? We look at a whole country and say, oh, well, there's a conflict there. No one can ever go back there. The truth is that there are conflicts of some kind in a vast proportion of countries all over the world. And if you're not prepared to send anyone back to a country which has some conflict in it, then you're going to be keeping a lot of people, which is exactly where we found ourselves, isn't it?
Yes. And I'm assuming that you didn't come across any sort of, human rights judges getting in the way, or people suggesting that, you can't send him back to Sudan because he's got mental health problems.
There's none of that, I think it's fair to say. I mean, I had incredible access to immigration chiefs, to naval chiefs, to Coast Guard officials, all sort of managed, as I understand it, by the Libyan National Army. It's complicated in Libya. It's a country in two parts. Basically, the west side, Tripoli, is a bit of a basket case, run by a bunch of warring militias. The east, Benghazi, where I was, is much more organized. And I was able to talk to a lot of people that are involved on the operational side of both smashing the gangs and deportations of migrants. Yeah. And they are more than aware of the insanity of how we approach this problem. I said to them, would you ever consider putting your detainees in luxury hotels? Yeah. And they just think absolutely bonkers. Right. Do insist that their detainees are looked after properly. I can't attest to that because I wasn't able to interview anyone who is in those detention centres. But what I would say is certainly on the Benghazi side, they are really trying to transform that city. They want Libya to move forward from a very dark and troubled past. And they're pretty acutely aware that human rights horrors are not a good look. So I think that they are improving the way people are looked after. They get healthcare, they get properly fed and clothed. But what they don't do is go completely over the top as we do. They're pretty grumpy about the fact that parts of Europe and the UK are behaving in such a way as to make our own countries, the UK in particular, a magnet. That is simply fueling the tidal wave of people that come up through Libya trying to get to the EU and to the UK.
No, of course. And I mean, there's a school of thought here in some quarters, mostly on the left, who say, what we need to do is to improve the lot of the people in these African countries so that they don't want to leave. Obviously, it's easier said than done. But what's the view in Libya on that kind of sort of proposal? Would they welcome some help from the West to go into places like Sudan and Somalia and Ethiopia and make them better countries somehow?
So I'm really glad you raised that question, because I've always been incredibly sceptical of this, this left-wing argument. Yeah. We've got to tackle the problem upstream, the lefties say. You've got to, you've basically got to fix Africa. Yeah. I mean, I've always thought that's absolutely ridiculous. It's a complete counsel of despair. The UK cannot be trying to fix Africa, solve wars in Sudan, make Eritrea more wealthy. But what I think we could do is be supporting the Libyan authorities that are actually trying to help us. They are subject to sanctions. There's no beating about the bush about that, which makes their work very difficult. They can't have helicopters, they can't have drones. Many people will say there's a good reason for that. But I think it is in our national interest. Forget trying to fix Sudan, forget trying to fix Chad. But what we could be doing is working with good Libyan authorities and actually supporting them in their operational work to stop the boats. And I think they're very open to that. And, Reform's position on this is that Reform will work with any country that can help us solve our immigration crisis. You don't have to like people to do business with them.
No, exactly right. Well, I mean, we used to spend a great deal of time doing business with people we actively didn't like, and this idea that somehow you have to sort of be favourable to people and only then can they be allies of yours. I mean, Keir Starmer was in Copenhagen today and he's talking about going upstream to the Balkan countries, and get this is their great idea to stop people coming from the Balkans, and that is to go to the Balkans and say to them, why don't you just stay where you are? They're going to persuade them not to leave. I mean, what sort of policy is that?
Completely ridiculous. And this is what I mean by the whole, ridiculousness of a let's fix Africa solution. But we must be prepared to work with countries that are helping us stop people from coming to the UK. And we need to be much more open-minded. Reform got a kicking for suggesting that they would work with the Taliban, and I understand why that sounds quite wild. But the reality is we are coping in the UK with a very significant number of both refugees but economic migrants from certain particular countries, and it is in our interest to work with the authorities such as they are. They don't even need to be national authorities. I mean, the issue in Libya is that it basically doesn't have a national government. It's got one in name, but it isn't really a thing. But why not deal with things at a local level, at a regional level? Because what do we need here? What we need is solutions. And what we're doing sure as hell isn't working.
No, exactly right. Let me ask you about your sort of musings on the week, because obviously it's been quite a big week for Reform. It wasn't their conference, but it seems as though it might have been. You know, that famous Telegraph cartoon that appeared, I think it was on Wednesday.
Yeah, brilliant cartoon.
Which was brilliant, saying, you know, I think next year we'll go to the Reform conference where they won't talk about Nigel Farage the whole bleeding time. But what's Reform's kind of... mood? I know you talk to those guys. I mean, you're not affiliated with them, but you know, what's the mood in the party after what Keir Starmer came out with? And I'm just talking to Will Geddes there about the security issues and all the dangerous things that Starmer kind of created for them. In a way, I suppose you would say it's been a good week for Reform again, hasn't it?
I think it has been a fantastic week for Reform. I think Keir Starmer's speech, you know, it's a bit like a budget, a conference speech sometimes. Yeah. It can take a few days to kind of percolate and for people to work out whether that intervention, that performance was a good or bad thing politically for the party. And I feel that whilst the audience in the room for Keir Starmer's speech lapped it up, they loved it. Well, they wouldn't they? He's very much preaching to the converted. That speech has really backfired nationally because essentially, whether or not Keir Starmer meant to do this, he's portrayed an awful lot of people in the UK as racist or supporting what he characterised as racist policies. And that is incredibly offensive to a vast number of people who are quite decent and not remotely racist and quite simply legitimately worried about mass uncontrolled immigration. And this whole thing of ramping up the rhetoric, you know, David Lammy was obviously absolutely pathetic.
Crazy.
That speech, you know, suggesting that Nigel Farage was flirted with the Hitler Youth. No basis for that whatsoever. The ramping up of rhetoric is a serious matter. I just caught the tail end of Will Geddes, who you had in before me. And, you know, Nigel's security situation is a daily and nightly headache. You know, it is a really, really serious thing. He gets very credible death threats on a pretty regular basis, and much of the security has to be privately funded, has been for years. I've known for a while that the security had been cut back, but you know, it's not something, as Will was saying, that one generally shouts about. But there's a point to be made here, which is that politicians of his stature, but particularly Nigel, are very, very exposed to nutters. But I've always thought that of course, it's not just Nigel, and of course, it's not just senior Reform figures. You know, every MP is vulnerable. I'm afraid history teaches us that it's often, I'm afraid, or the cases that we've had, the tragedies we've had have not actually been the most high profile political figures.
No, absolutely not. And again, it's always unexpected, and that's the whole problem. We've got to run. Isabel, great to see you. Thank you very much indeed. Isabel Oakeshott, Talks International editor there, with her trip to Libya. Some interesting things to be taken from that. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure.